Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Adrian Goldsworthy and David Bryant.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've said to our Adrian Goldsworthy, our very, very intellectual new friend, that I represent the layman in the audience. And we'll try to have this discussion at a very high level, but what I bring to it is absolute stunning respect for Adrian's mind, all of his writing. He writes both fiction and nonfiction, and the quality of his writing is absolutely outstanding. So, if we can begin, our book today is Pax Romana, and would you say that the Romans were, within your summary, were the Romans peacekeepers or peacemakers?
They start out as troublemakers, to be quite honest, because you have to remember this is a city on the Tiber in Italy that, over the course of the centuries, ends up owning most of the known world, and you don't do that if you have an obsessive love of peace. The problem is, when you look at the ancient world, you can find nobody at all who had even almost the expectation that relations between states should be peaceful. You know, we expect peace to be normal. War breaks out. War destroys peace. But in the ancient world, most societies you look at have more of a view that this is a world where you're facing constant threats. The Greek philosophers come very, very close. Both Plato and Aristotle stop slightly short of saying that warfare is natural between communities, but it's wafer thin where they've got to. And you have, when you think the great epic of Greek literature, you know, the Iliad is all about war. And it's about rivalries within one side on a war as well. It's not, you know, and it's accepted that if you can raid your neighbor and steal his cattle, then you'll do it. And it's quite telling that the Greek historian Polybius, who in second half of the 2nd century BC wrote his universal history with the express purpose of explaining how on earth these Romans, this load of barbarians from Italy, had suddenly come to dominate the Mediterranean world over the course of about 50 years. Throughout this book, most of which survives, although sadly we've lost quite a lot of it, he never asks the question, why did the Romans want to conquer? All he's interested in is how did they do it? What was it about their constitution? What was it about their army? What was it about their approach to international relations that made them so successful? As far as he was concerned, if you could dominate, you would. That was the natural human thing to do, because if you don't dominate, then you will be dominated by someone else. So this is a book about Roman peace. This is about the empire they created, which I argue was, compared to what came before and what came after for a very long time, far more peaceful and prosperous than anything else on offer. But it happened as a result of conquest, and then almost accidentally of, well, we've got this domination, what do we do? How do we deal with this? What's the best way? So you look back on the ancient world, and one of the main feelings you will have about it is, I'm glad I don't live there. Because it wasn't a nice place. This was a brutal place. It was a dangerous place. There were no peaceful states out there. The Romans were predators, in a sense, but so was everyone else. The Romans was just not simply better at war and conquest, but they were far better at making a settlement afterward, of making the end of the war, making the peace last. So I think it's a gradual thing.
Was their conquest designed to expand territory so they would have borders farther away from Rome to defend?
Not really. I mean, there was an analysis that argued that in the 19th, early 20th century, a lot of scholars looked at it and they wanted to see the Romans as essentially themselves, just in togas. And the idea was that you shouldn't go declaring war for no particular reason. The Romans believed, or liked to believe, that all their wars were just. But a just war could be defending yourself against attack, but it could also be defending your interests, defending your prestige, your power. If you think about it, imperium, the Latin word from which we get empire, it means power. It was never really about physical territory, occupying lines on a map. This was about your power, which you defined in a very vague way, but it was more about stopping anyone doing anything you didn't like, but also very occasionally trying to get them to do things. In the main, it was more of a reactive thing. You just didn't want someone to come at you or cause trouble or do anything you didn't particularly like, but you weren't that interested in running their affairs. So there is an element of you fight wars because you feel you're under attack and under threat. And we should remember that, especially in the 3rd century BC, to some extent before that, the Romans were under threat. Now, this is Rome that you've got the famous story of it being sacked by the Gauls in the early 4th century BC. Many Italian communities and Latin communities were overrun and effectively collapsed by various migratory groups, Oscan speakers from the Apennines, groups of Gauls who overran part of northern Italy. This was a dangerous world. And when the Romans fought Hannibal, Hannibal spent over a decade marauding around Italy. In the first 3 years of his invasion of Italy, which began in 218 BC, at least 100,000 adult male Romans and Italians were killed by Hannibal in that time, out of a population estimated at about 700,000 of military age. In a single day at the Battle of Cannae, 50,000 Romans and Italians were killed, along with nearly 100 senators out of a Senate, your governing body, that consists of 300 people. So a third of your governing class dies in one day, and a large chunk of your male population dies in one day. And we are talking about fatalities. This is not like the casualties you get in the First World War battles that generally include the wounded, the missing, the prisoners. All of these people are dead. On top of those, you've got about another 20,000 that are prisoners and are sold as slaves. No other state in the ancient world could have coped with those sorts of losses and continued the war. And it staggered Hannibal because he did the natural thing that any other commander would do in this era. He'd inflicted this disaster on the Romans, and it's the third in a succession of disasters that get bigger and bigger. And he immediately did what anyone should do. He sent ambassadors to Rome itself to negotiate an exchange of prisoners, routine thing done in those days, but also it was assumed that that would allow you to begin peace negotiations where you would impose terms. The Romans would pay you a large amount of money. They would probably give up some territory. Some of their allies would become your allies instead of theirs, but they would not cease to exist. The Romans do something that no one else would have done at the time. They tell Hannibal's ambassador that if he isn't off their land in 24 hours, then he will lose his diplomatic immunity and they will kill him. And they simply won't talk. And they even ban families from ransoming the prisoners, their own family members. Now, if you contrast that with Alexander the Great, who could go to the Persian Empire, win 3 battles, and the Persians basically say, right, fair enough, that's it, you're better than us, you're now king. And nearly every ancient army, the Persian armies that invaded Greece, had exiled kings of Sparta, exiled aristocrats from the other Greek cities, with the enemy, with the invaders. Until the very late period of the end of the Roman Empire, the Romans don't do that. The Romans identify incredibly strongly with the state, at least in this period, and even their allies see being a friend of Rome as preferable to the alternative of not being a friend of Rome. In part, that's because the Romans are pretty nasty to any ally that defects, but also it's the sense that you get more. Every Roman army in the period that conquered the empire consisted of at least 50% allied soldiers. And these are people, these are the sons of the people who fought you 20 years ago. And they come on and they serve in your army, and they don't get quite as much in terms of the spoils, the prestige, the benefits of conquest, but they get quite a lot of it. And the armies that Hannibal is wiping out in these early days, and for years afterwards, I mean, he continues to inflict horrendous casualties on the Romans. These are volunteer armies of citizens with property. You had to own property to be eligible to serve in the Roman army in this period. So this is not sending off just your young or your poor or your conscripts. These are volunteers that come forward out of a sense of duty to the state. The state will feed them while they're in the army, but it doesn't pay them anything more than pocket money. And at the end of their service, they go home and the state has no responsibility for them. It's back to your farm, back to the life you had before this. And they continue volunteering. There is never a case during this period where people try to dodge the draft or simply don't turn up. And the state doesn't have the mechanisms to compel them to do this. It's purely this sense of community, this sense of duty. The res publica, the public thing, the commonwealth is perhaps the best translation, or the closest equivalent we can have, was something that people identified with, and even in some quite odd ways, some of the allied communities are offered Roman citizenship as a reward for their valor fighting Hannibal, and they turn it down. They say, we still want to be Latins, but we will be your staunch friends, and they continue to be that. So it's a very... The Roman state is really like no other in the ancient world, because it keeps on absorbing other peoples, but it makes them Roman. And it's almost like a sort of, it's a reverse of America, where you can have successive waves of immigrants come in and become integrated. The Romans go out and conquer enemies, and then those enemies help them to conquer more people, because they become, first of all, perhaps allies, then Latins, then Roman. And very soon, there is no ethnic basis whatsoever to being a Roman. And the number of Romans dwarfs that of the number of citizens of any other state in the ancient world. And they have this generosity with citizenship. Athens, the more democratic it became, the more restrictive it became on eligibility for citizenship. You had to prove several generations of both parents being Athenian, because that was democracy was such a precious thing. Your ability to participate in this was seen to be so valuable that you couldn't spread it around. The Romans, by contrast, even the slaves they free become Roman citizens. Nobody else does that in the ancient world. So it's a very different thing from early on.
What were the spoils of war, typically? And you mentioned dividing that up among the conquering soldiers. Is there any typical model for that?
We have these stories of, it almost sounds, I mean, the thing it reminds me of most is those odd constitutions you have from some of the pirate ships in the sort of 17th century, where they define very clearly what each crew member gets and what you get in terms if you suffer a wound and all this sort of thing. The Roman army was supposed to get all the plunder, all the spoils they gathered, gather it centrally, and then divide it up in proportion to all its members. Obviously, the leaders, the aristocrats, the elected politicians who go out and lead the armies get the biggest share. The profits you're making consist of the movable spoils, so it's a good thing to go and fight a war in the Eastern Mediterranean. Those are always desperately popular. Loads of volunteers come forward because everyone knows that all the Greeks are rich. So if you go off and beat the Seleucids in Syria or something like that, or you go to Macedonia or Cilicia or anything like that, the Romans come to believe that A, they're not very good at fighting, but boy, they've got loads of cash. So this is the place to be. Whereas you go and fight some Spaniard who lives on a hilltop, and he's a pretty tough individual who's going to give you a real run for your money fighting-wise, and then he hasn't got anything much to steal at the end of it. So sometimes less popular. The other depressing reality of the ancient world is, of course, that you want to capture people, and you don't massacre all your enemies, because human life does have a tangible value. You can sell people as slaves, and huge numbers of people are sold into slavery, particularly in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. It's claimed, though we can't be certain about the figure, that during his 10-year campaign in Gaul in the 1st century BC, that Julius Caesar enslaved 1 million people. Probably not far out. They would have kept records of all of this. The Romans, from early on in their history, even before they're writing history and formal accounts, they keep accounts, they keep lists of figures, they keep numbers, they quantify everything very precisely. Most of this evidence has gone, but you can see it in Cicero's speeches and the court cases. The evidence was there. They were very careful about counting things and keeping track of where the money went and where everything went. So human spoils are a big part of it. But as I say, whereas slavery in most societies tends to be something where it's pretty much an end. You're unlikely ever to be freed. The Romans not only free a considerable number of their slaves, but they also, if your owner was a Roman citizen and you're freed, you are a Roman citizen. You have slightly less rights than a full citizen, but your child will be a full Roman citizen. And by the end of the 1st century BC, even most senators are aware that they have slaves in their ancestry, because there is no ethnic basis to slavery whatsoever. You know, a slave is anyone who's had the misfortune to be captured in war. And the Romans even have to have legislation whereby if a Roman is captured by a foreign enemy, then he has to go through a process to become a citizen again, even after he's been freed. It isn't just automatic, you come home and that's it, because you are considered to have become a slave of your conqueror. But then they define it that if this wasn't a proper war, so if you were captured by a barbarian tribe who sort of kidnapped you or overran you, then you didn't have to go through all this because that wasn't a proper war. They weren't an official enemy of the state. So the Romans, again, are the people we can thank for incredibly complicated legalistic language, because that's what Latin does, and it does it very well. And the Romans, they like to define things. They like, whereas the Greeks love their abstracts and their concepts, the Romans like everything very clear-cut and something you can define. So there's that. There's also in time land. But one of the striking things is that whereas there are bursts of colonization where the Romans will conquer an area and they'll set up, particularly in Italy, they will establish colonies of citizens, of Latins, who are partly a garrison, but also they'll be given farms in that area, and the idea is they develop it. On the whole, the Roman Empire isn't, once you get outside Italy, about conquering territory that you then give to your citizens. In the main, the land will continue to be owned by locals. You might settle a few. A lot of Roman businessmen are going to turn up before the legions arrive and certainly afterwards, because there are advantages to being a Roman and doing business there. But this is not about, you make the world Roman, but you don't do it by exporting Romans and settling them everywhere else. You turn the people you conquer into you. And that, again, is something that I don't think anyone has ever quite done to the same extent.
And in your book, it was surprising to read the importance of farming and the class to which one is assigned or achieves through owning land and farming.
They have this, I mean, it's partly a romantic tie to the land as well. You can look at Virgil's poetry and all this sort of thing. There's this sense that the perfect life is that of a small farmer. Get away from it all. And of course, you know, you have the story of Cincinnatus, you know, the dictator who, Rome in its early days is in a crisis. They summon Cincinnatus from his farm. They give him absolute power, something they never normally do in any normal circumstances. And he goes off, leads the army, beats up the enemy, lays down his power, go back. You know, the story was they found him plowing and sort of summoned him off to save the state. Once he's done that, I'm going home. You know, it's like the end of a Western where Shane rides off or something like that. It's but this is very much a lot of the Greek ideas of the city-state that leads to the ideas of democracy are tied in with the land. These are communities of farmers, and that's also true to a great extent of the communities in Italy and the Romans. And this is one of they have this strong sense that if you own land, if you farm it, if you're tilling the soil, if you are not interested just in a quick profit, but this is a long-term thing. This is something you want to keep doing year after year to raise your family, and then they will inherit this and go on. Then you have a stronger bond with the state. And you also have the obligation, because you own this land, you benefit from it, you will want to protect it. So as a group, all these farmers should go off and serve in the army when the state requires them, serve together, but go home afterwards. The Roman army of the 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC, to some extent even the 1st, the period when most of the conquest of the empire occurs, is almost completely invisible archaeologically, because it doesn't have a life outside a campaign. You go off, you serve in the army, you could be called upon for up to 16 years of your life serving in the army if the state required it, or 16 campaigns if there was a campaign lasted less than a year. But once you went home, you wouldn't set up a tombstone in which you said, I was a soldier and I did all of these things. You were simply a citizen. This was part of what being a citizen meant. And the army consisted of those with sufficient property to provide themselves with military equipment that was required by certain grades of service. So your cavalry were your wealthiest because they could afford a horse and probably know how to ride. And horses aren't that common in Italy. It's not good horse country. So you know, this is an elite thing. And then the bulk of the legions in this period are the sort of solid yeoman farmers. You know, they've got to own a fair bit of land. They've probably got a few slaves. They need somebody to run the farm while they go away as well and fight this war. But they willingly not only submit themselves to military service, but they accept the imposition of incredibly strict discipline that is perhaps a little bit short of the brutality of the Spartan military regime, but nevertheless, as a citizen, you have huge legal rights. You cannot be condemned without a trial. Even if you are condemned, you are not subject to certain forms of punishment like flogging, like crucifixion. You go into the army, and all those rights go. And you can be punished without a trial by your commanders, who are supposedly the people you've elected to lead you in the state. For things like stealing from a comrade in the camp, you can be executed. You can be beaten to death for going to sleep on guard. And they willingly submit to this. But then again, once they leave, they go back to being a full citizen again, and you get all those rights. So they have this strong sense of what's appropriate for wartime, what's appropriate for peacetime. But they are the people who conquer the Roman Empire, and certainly the people who defeat Hannibal and the great military powers of the Hellenistic East, are these farmer soldiers doing this not as a career, but out of duty. Over time, that becomes more and more of a strain on the system. It's very difficult to send someone who's a farmer off to Spain for 10 years to garrison a distant frontier outpost, where he may come back, he may not. But what state's the farm going to be in by the time he does? So eventually they start to have problems. People don't want to serve, not because they don't want to fight for the state, but they don't want to be away for so long. And there is a movement towards taking volunteers from people who didn't have the property to qualify them in the past. The Expectancy, as they're called. The people who are in the census are only counted by their name. They don't have any property to register whatsoever. It's the head count. The bottom class, the people whose vote counted for least in the Roman electoral system, these start to provide the soldiers, because for them, even the poor salary given to troops is better than no employment at all. And that will start to change Roman society fundamentally. But a lot of the changes that come in are a result of empire, and trying to run an empire with the institutions of a small city-state, as that empire gets bigger and bigger, as the amount of money that has flooded in, the profits from empire become so huge and distort the social system, in that the wealthy become so fabulously wealthy that the difference between them and the people lower down widens, that the system comes under strain. It has to change, and that's when you have the breakdown of the Republic and civil wars and all sorts of problems like that, which is another huge topic.
Now, when the Army added the lower classes, shall we say, or non-property holders, were they as effective as fighters as the property owners?
Not at first. It's one of the paradoxes of Roman history, is that when this starts to happen, when you have to rely on volunteers who tend to be from the poorest, you'll get some kids who are bored on the farm and run off to join the army, as you would in any generation. But on the whole, if you're starting to choose this for, probably the evidence is poor. Even at that period, you're talking about 7 years of your life you're signing up for. By the time the Emperor Augustus makes this formal and the army becomes a permanent professional force, by the end of Augustus's life, you are signing up for 25 years. So it is a huge commitment for under this brutal discipline, and with pay that's not that special. At first, these professional soldiers are rawer in terms of the material they offer, and it's only at the beginning of the 1st century BC, late 2nd, early 1st century, where the Roman army starts to introduce more training. The Roman army starts to equip soldiers. They've done it, they've replaced equipment you've lost before, but the idea was you came with the family sword that was hung over the fireplace, with your shield, with your helmet, with your armor, that you provided for yourself. And it had to be of a standard pattern near enough. But once the army starts saying, okay, no, we know nobody's got anything, so we're going to clothe you, we're going to equip you, they also have to train you. You can't rely on the fact that you've been taught since you were a kid to use a sword, to throw a javelin, to march, all of these things. So oddly enough, there's the introduction of all the methods that were used in the gladiatorial schools for training gladiators become adopted by the Roman army. Now, it's slightly circular because those had obviously originally come from this is how you fight in a battle. But that is introduced, and in the longer run, the professional army will be far more efficient. It will become the closest thing to a modern army that you have really until the 17th, 18th century. And it's larger than many of those. For sheer numbers of professional soldiers, the army of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD is bigger than anything you get before the French Revolution. You know, you're talking a standing army of 350,000, sometimes larger, at least in theory, at least on paper. Particularly given the population size of the ancient world, this is huge. Though, in terms of sheer size of the empire, it's actually not that big once you spread it out. Eventually, the professional army will become far more efficient because it has the advantage that it can have a sort of corporate memory. The problem with the Republican army, with the volunteer army, is that everybody turns up because it's their duty. And they're all very keen, and they're all willing to submit to this discipline, but they've not served next to each other before, they've not served under these leaders before. It takes months, at least, to train them to a reasonable level, years probably to make them efficient. And the intensity of warfare in the ancient world is less than that of the modern era. So there's a telling comment by one of Caesar's commanders where he talks about 2 legions that Julius Caesar had raised early on in the campaigns in Gaul and had now served 8 years of some of the most intensive fighting in the ancient world. And he describes them as not yet as good as the veterans in Caesar's army, as the legions he already had that he took over in Gaul. Because of the way casualties tend to work, if you don't suffer serious disasters in an ancient battle, if you don't lose, the casualties are disproportionately inflicted on the losing side, because in the end, all casualties in an ancient battle will be inflicted by muscle power. And all of this has got to happen at very close range. You are either being hit by a thrown missile, occasionally by a shot missile, but normally it's by javelins, by heavy spears, this sort of thing, or you are being killed by a sword or spear point at a distance of a yard or 2. Very, very close. Now, in most ancient battles, the overwhelming majority of casualties occur when one side runs away. Because when you're fighting that close, when the morale snaps, when you break, when you turn and run, then not only does the victor suddenly become inspired and everybody becomes an Achilles and very heroic, because they've been scared out of their wits anyway at this point and try to stay alive, but suddenly there's no longer any risk. And human beings seem to kill more readily when the opponent is helpless. So you get cases where it's rare for a victorious army to suffer more than 5% casualties. The losing army might suffer 50% or more, quite easily. So if the army keeps winning, you don't lose that many people, which means the ones you've got keep on surviving. Now, obviously, there's disease and all sorts of other things that are major contributors, but it takes a long time for a soldier to mature. It's something that, whereas in the modern era, anyone who survived that long would probably be getting to the point of combat fatigue where they're no longer as efficient as they had been. In the ancient world, it takes a lot longer to reach that stage. There are cases where you get the impression of similar sorts of strains and similar results. There's one of the Roman general Marius who was ill and seems to have suffered a breakdown. There's this description in Plutarch of him imagining he was commanding an army, and he's sort of running up and down a room shouting orders at people and fighting. And this is someone who's getting on a bit, who's seen a lot of combat, and there just seems to be the strain that the balance is going a little bit. And there are hints of it, but on the whole, you can fight for longer in the ancient world than you probably could in the modern era. So in the end, the professional army will become unlike anything else in the ancient world. Alexander the Great's soldiers were veterans who conquered the Persian Empire and got as far as India, but they're basically a sort of one-off. These people do this. That particular group are incredibly efficient soldiers and people you simply didn't want to mess with. Some of these men, when they're in their 70s and fighting in the civil wars after Alexander's death, still terrify the opposition. And they win partly because the other side tends to run away when you see them coming. But I mean, you know, you're dealing with people who would be considered elderly in our society. And in the ancient world, this is, you know, ancient in truth. But that was a rarity. The Roman army, because it's professional, it can pass on the experience to the next generation of soldiers. It can start to train people. How it does this is not always easy to see. It's also an army that is bureaucratic to an extent that any modern soldier is going to recognize. And you can look at documents, duty rosters, reports from Roman army finds, whether on papyrus or wooden writing tablets, you could stick up in a barrack block today, and people would look at it and say, yeah, I know how this is working. To an obsessive degree, the Romans seem to have copied everything not just in triplicate, but quadruplicate. And there is a paper trail following every soldier and every animal that goes into the Roman army, right the way through their career. Even to the extent where you have a sort of slang word. They used to mark someone who died with the Greek letter theta, that then becomes a verb, thetatus, as a sort of slang for being killed. These sorts of things, it's all there. But so you have this infrastructure behind the army, you have this training system behind the army, you have all these bases that are built all around the empire that fall into essentially the same plan, that are recognizably similar, whether they're in Syria or northern Britain. And the army it's not identical in everything it does, and it's very flexible and it adapts, but it's recognizably the same beast, wherever it is. So that professional army, in most respects, was superior to the earlier one, but it is also politically far less committed to the state, because the soldiers aren't paid very well, they're not treated very well, and they tend to be, whereas you could not imagine a civil war in the 2nd century BC or 3rd century BC, you have spates of them in the 1st century when the Republic breaks down, because soldiers are more loyal to their generals than they are to the state, and you get a degree of peace for the first 2 centuries AD. From 218 AD onwards to 476, when the last emperor in the West dies, there are only 3 decades without a civil war. They just keep fighting themselves. And the Roman army remains efficient into the 5th century. And one of the best studies on this, by a chap called Hugh Elton a few years back, made the point that even in those latter stages, when you see the Roman Empire falling apart, the Roman army wins most of the battles it fights. The bit he didn't say was that most of the battles it fights are actually against other Romans, so it sort of loses them as well. It's a desperately long answer to probably a different question to the one asked. But with all of this, it's one of the dangers when you talk about the Romans. Everybody tends to lump together centuries of human history, and things change. And this is it's a big story, or lots of stories.
What was the lifespan of those soldiers you're describing? Typically, I mean, if there is such a thing as a typical, I don't mean dying in battle, but I mean these young men. How long, what was the expected lifespan?
It's very hard to say. There are a few indications. You couldn't stand for the consulship, the senior office of the Roman Republic. There were 2 consuls every year. They gave their name to the year. You couldn't stand for that post until you were 42. So that gives you an indication that they're expecting at least a substantial number of people to get there. Infant mortality is appallingly high, as we would see it. And perhaps the most dangerous part of your military service is going to be in your late teens and your 20s, both for an aristocrat and an ordinary soldier. The mortality rate is also greatly increased because at all levels of society, women are usually married quite young and expected to produce children from quite young, so an awful lot do die in childbirth. And you have, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his wife had 12 children, of whom only 4 reached adulthood. That's exceptionally bad. It was probably unfortunate for the world that one of those 4 was the Emperor Commodus, who was a complicated lad with issues who liked dressing as a female gladiator, which is, odd. And of course, famously, Russell Crowe kills him off in the Colosseum anyway, doesn't he? But so there are distortions to life expectancy, and we simply do not have the evidence to trace population in the Roman Empire or the economy. There are so many gaps. And there has been a trend in recent years to use United Nations life tables and all this sort of thing. Oddly enough, there's a sort of perverse reaction amongst academics, because the thing you so often encounter when you talk to a general audience about the Romans is people say, well, they were so modern, weren't they? They had glass in the windows, they had central heating, they had bathhouses, they had all this technology. And in many respects, the Romans do seem quite modern. The academic trend has been to try and emphasize how ancient they were. And this has been taken to somewhat absurd degrees, where one of the recent demographic studies claimed that life expectancy in the Roman Empire was worse than in the early Neolithic. It's clearly nonsense. I think, actually, what we're finding with archaeology is that now different techniques have come of identifying sites, most of which we don't have the money to excavate, at least at the moment. more and more sites are turning up everywhere in the ancient world, particularly from the Roman period, but also from the pre-Roman Iron Age. You know, it's now clear that much of Britain was deforested before the Romans arrived and already under the plough. It's now surprising, excavations on Hadrian's Wall done with more modern techniques, it's surprising if you don't discover plough marks under it. So this thing is built not in sort of rugged mountains and forests, it's built over farmland. And even what's now Scotland, large parts of that, probably before the Romans arrived, is already being cultivated. And it will actually, there will be less cultivation in the Dark Ages than you have in the previous. So something is going on, and the impression, the sheer number of settlements does suggest to me that I think the population figures for the ancient world will gradually increase as we understand this evidence. At the moment, the figure that's often bandied around for the population of the Roman Empire is about 60 million. I'm pretty sure that's too low, but it's certainly not going to have been less than that, of whom about 4 million would be Roman citizens. But again, that's the number we have from the Roman census for Roman citizens, but what the sources don't tell us is that just men? Is that just adults? Is it everybody? And depending on the answers to those questions, then the proportion this represents becomes completely different. So I think if you made it to 30, or certainly if you made it to 40, you had a good chance of making it to 70 in the ancient world. The dangerous bits were early on. This is a world that's prone to quite severe epidemics, and one of the drawbacks of urbanization is that if you concentrate everybody in these cities, or you concentrate the professional army in these rows and rows of barrack blocks, that when there is an outbreak of any serious epidemic or plague, the results tend to be particularly bad in these areas. But whereas you can measure the consequences of, say, the Black Death in the 14th century, you can't do that with the Antonine plagues of the 2nd century AD. We just get anecdotes about it, we get the impression, and we know of a few high-profile victims of the plague, but we don't really know the consequences and the scale of it. There is so much of Roman history we cannot quantify, and that's unlikely ever to change.
We were chatting in the green room, and you've brought it here, the notion of archaeology and its reliability. You had some wonderful stories you were mentioning to me.
Archaeology is invaluable, and it does tell us a lot more about the ancient world. And one thing that's very useful, if you're dealing with the Roman expansion into Europe, then virtually every society in Europe, and some of those, a lot of them in North Africa and some elsewhere in the Middle East as well, were not literate societies. So they leave no records of their own. So to try and understand how they thought about things, and also what they were like and how life changes when the Romans arrive, to a great extent you're dealing with a mixture of what the Romans say about this, but the only way of sort of getting some other sense of this is through the archaeology. But archaeology tells you about long-term trends. It tells you about structures like buildings, patterns of agriculture sometimes. It can tell you something about the environment. So for instance, northern Britain at the time just before Hadrian's Wall was built was milder than it is now. But within a century, it seems to have moved to much more of a modern climate. So you get these little pictures, but you also get a sense of a lot of things you discover will be a ditch or a wall or a piece of pottery. There is only so much you can actually extrapolate from that about a society. Or one of the oddest statements I've ever come across, written by a scholar for whom I have immense respect, and I think he was just having a bit of a brainstorm that day, was talking about early Roman history and the origins of the city of Rome, and said, for the period of the 6th century BC, we have extensive finds of funerary remains, goods that were dedicated with the ashes of the deceased, various things about burial practice. And because of all this, this knowledge of burial, we know a lot about everyday life. Logic of these people are dead, you know, this is that's the, so they have, you can seize on what you find archaeologically and you try and make it do all sorts of things. An extreme form of this, I remember being at a dinner in my college when I was doing my doctorate at Oxford, sitting next to a chap who was working on the Neolithic, the early Neolithic as well. And his argument, his basic central thesis was that in the communities he was careful not to refer to these communities as tribes because that has all sorts of implications, but this isn't really a better word for it, that the women were the sort of repositories of collective memory, they were the storytellers, they told identity of the different groups. Now, as far as I could see, his evidence for this was a few pieces of flint. And while it might be true, basically he'd taken anthropological theory and said, well, this is the sort of thing that could happen in a society at this sort of technological level, there's so much we don't know. And the voices of many of these pre-literate societies, we simply cannot reach. Whatever we do, you can look at possibilities, you can explore the range of what may have been, you get glimpses, but that's as far as it will go. And archaeology itself tends to be reinterpreted. Our methods are far superior now to the ones that were common 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And sometimes you've got dramatic evidence from a site that was excavated in 1900 that's now very difficult to interpret because you're not quite sure whether they saw what they thought they were seeing. The drawback of this is that as archaeology becomes more precise, as it extracts more information from the material, it becomes more expensive, more time-consuming, so the area covered gets smaller and smaller. So whereas in the old days you'd go to a site and you'd rip everything out and just follow the walls around and you'd have this lovely site for tourists to look around, now they'll start digging all these little trenches, pull a few bits out, then cover it up again because there definitely isn't going to be the money to conserve this or put it on display. And everything relies on interpretation, so that if ever you hear an archaeologist, particularly someone from the Bronze Age, Iron Age, or even the Roman period, saying that something obviously had a ritual purpose, that means they don't know. And that basically is a good excuse, a good explanation of something is that, oh yes, it was clearly in ritual. One of the other problems is that I remember a friend of mine arguing this should come early on in archaeological training. You are asking people with no background in construction, building, in farming, to understand all of these things and to take glimpses of it and then explain how this was going on. They will often come out with completely cockeyed ideas that if you went to speak to someone who did this for a living, you would say, well, that's, it's interesting that two of the most important contributions to our understanding of Hadrian's Wall, that big monument in northern Britain, have come from, in one case, a stonemason and another, a surveyor. And the stonemason pointed out that if you're going to build a wall, the thing that really restricts you is actually scaffolding. It's not the availability of the material for the wall itself, but you can build up to about 5 foot safely. Once you try and build anything higher than that, you need scaffolding. Now, if you're using all the stone to build the wall, the scaffolding has to come from trees, it needs timber. Now, if, as we now know, this area is largely deforested before the Romans arrive, one of the reasons the wall takes so long to build may not be that they haven't got the manpower or the stone to build it, it's that they haven't got the wood, and they're having to reuse the same stuff. Another contribution came when somebody looked and said, okay, you're laying this 80-mile long feature out, how do you do the surveying? And they discovered that different aspects of the wall are surveyed from different starting places, that some of the features that join on afterwards are done in a different way altogether. So it's interesting where you get someone who has done this in a practical sense. We do have to remember these were real people doing these things. This is not, and they weren't living their lives for our benefit. There's sometimes a tendency with some studies of the ancient world, institutions like the Roman army, where you almost feel it's such a puzzle and a problem that you get into the mentality of thinking that these people lived their lives just to create this sort of mystery for us to solve. They didn't care. They were doing what they were doing for reasons that made sense to them, or were habit, or were, simply you did it that way because you always had. So, oh dear, gosh. Sorry.
Oh, it's fine.
That aspect is very useful. You've got to be careful not to impose modern ways of thinking. This is a world without maps as we would understand it. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean the Romans didn't know how to get around, or they didn't know how to survey things, or they didn't understand these things. So that you often get the technological limitation is imposed. The Romans couldn't possibly have thought this way because they didn't possess detailed maps. But then the scholars who've come out with these ideas fail to realize that most of European history was conducted without very good, precise maps. You know, Britain only started mapping itself with the Ordnance Survey in response to the threat of invasion by revolutionary France and Napoleon. And he didn't complete the task for decades afterwards. I helped out with a friend on an archaeological site in Bulgaria, and this was an official state-declared archaeological park. They didn't have a map of the entire area to the same scale. They had 3 to different scales stapled together. And it simply was part of the job. We took some students out there who were doing surveying work with GPS stuff to create a map for them. Much of the world has not been mapped until relatively recently, and yet people have gone out and created kingdoms, empires, and all this sort of thing. Right?
Well,
Is the counting going
Adrian,
up now? Have I got an extra bit?
Adrian, we're honored to have had you here at our Writers' Festival. His mind is larger than any mind I think I've ever seen, and I mean that honestly. So it's been a pleasure
Polite
to
way of
attempt
saying
to
I have a very large head.
been a pleasure to attempt to interview you, but your brilliance is appreciated by all of our readers and our angels. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for inviting me.